So we acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also, sorry, can't do the echo. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Miigwech. So the first item on the agenda is the declarations of possible conflict of interest. Does anyone have a conflict to declare? Hearing none, the next item is delegations. We only have one delegation that was applied for this evening. Excuse me. And that is John Weatherapp. Oh, could somebody open the door, please? Just noticing that that's closed. But it's supposed to be in person, or? Okay, so we don't have the delegate here. So I guess we'll move on to staff reports, which is item 4. So item 4.1 is continuing education program budget report. And this is, I believe, based on CIAC's recent motion. And who's speaking to this? Okay, passing it to Associate Director Risco.
Thank you very much. And through the chair, it is our pleasure to be bringing this report to the Board of Trustees. At the June 13th special FBEC meeting, trustees requested an outline itemizing the breakdown by program of the deficit for continuing education. Certainly staff are recognizing that continuing education is running at a $6.7 million deficit, and certainly analyzing income per program compared to expenditures is very important. The report goes on, trustees, to define what programs are under the purview of continuing education, and then you will see a variety of charts outlining income from GSNs, details in regards to delivery of times, number of locations associated with each of the program, as well as the net revenue, whether we are operating at a deficit or a surplus. And as we have already identified, overall, we are running at a $6.7 million deficit. Joining me this evening are Central Superintendent, Assistant Superintendent Peter Chang, as well as Namita Agrawal, our business manager, and Norbert Costa, who is the centrally assigned principal to this file. I'd like to just make some high-level comments in regards to the programs, and we are certainly pleased to answer any questions that you may have. The administration line is running at a approximately $800,000 deficit. This is in support of approximately 6 to 7 support staff, marketing officer, receptionist, as well as other personnel. Adult credit day schools has a significant deficit of $2,238,000. What I would like to point out on that line within the Appendix A is you'll notice that there are 5 locations that are providing adult credit day programs. Secondly, the GSN does not pay for vice principals, PORs, which are positions of responsibility, and office staff. The GSN only pays for classroom teachers, so that infrastructure surrounding the program isn't funded. It only funds permanent staff. So the other detail that I would ask you to notice is that there is a difference in the total revenue compared to salaries and benefits. So the takeaway there is that we are paying more in salaries and benefits than the GSN provides. Looking forward, we're going to be monitoring class sizes to be making sure that we are operating at the top end of enrollment wherever possible. And going forward, we will need to analyze the number of sites that are offering adult credit day schools. So the takeaway from this line is that, echoing our last comments, that we certainly are aware that we need to be looking for efficiencies, but it is fairly complicated because of the number of sites and the itemization that I just provided. On the next page for secondary credit, night school, summer school, et cetera, there's a small differential between total revenue and salaries and benefits. Our strategy to be looking at the $313,000 deficit on that line will be making sure that we're monitoring class sizes. The next significant deficit area is elementary international languages and African heritage. So you'll see a deficit of just slightly over $3 million. So what I would want to be pointing out there again is the total revenue is very substantially lower than the salaries and benefits. These are QPB employees, they are instructors, and our salary and benefits provide higher levels of salary than the GSN provides. We have 150 sites offering these programs in person, and there are limitations in the collective agreement about closing classes that may diminish through time from enrollment. So going forward, our opportunities are to analyze the days of the week that we offer the courses and the number of sites, and certainly to be paying attention to those collective agreement clauses to be ensuring that we're making decisions regarding whether classes run in the time that is afforded us in the collective agreement. The rest of the programs, you'll see trustees operate slightly above what revenues generate. At this time, we'd be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Trustee Laskin, go ahead.
Much, Madam Chair. I'm privileged to have an adult day school within the ward I represent, and I know that it is full. So can you just advise if all the sites of adult day school actually are full of students?
Through you, Chair. We have in the 5 adult day schools, we have 2 programs. There is the adult day school offered by Continuous Education.
And advanced.
And advanced, yes. Right. There are sites that are at a higher utilization rate than others. I would say that there are a couple of them that are underutilized by space. We have one school, for example, that has 600 students in the adult day, built for probably in a bigger space. But then we have others like, for example, I'll think of Calc. Calc has approximately 1,200 students enrolled, and that pretty much is maximizing the space available. So not every site is using the space that is available.
Okay, so my concern is if we looked at consolidation of them, they wouldn't be as accessible to the students that actually need these schools as lifelines, not just for the advanced program for the 18 to 21-year-olds, but actually the adults who use it as an opportunity to get gainful employment following their course selection. So my eyes certainly were opened up representing a ward that had Yorkdale in it, for example. Before that, I really did not understand the importance of the adult day schools within our system. So I guess I'm asking the analysis of these programs can't simply be based on funding. They have to be based on our values, our expectations, and if we truly believe in lifelong learning, we have to understand these are valuable within our system context. So that's my piece on the adult schools. Now the elementary international languages and African heritage. When I was a parent back in the early 90s, I would go to deputations at the former Toronto board. representing my school council and make it clear that even though my school council thought these programs were not valuable at all because of the demographics, what they represented, I always spoke for myself about the importance of students carrying on their languages, their cultures, and learning about language and culture. And again, I feel really strongly that this can't be simply a funding decision, but a decision on if we truly believe in and all the research shows that kids with multiple languages really are successful, and kids that have another language actually are more successful at acquiring English. So again, I'm just speaking in complete support. Yes, if we can run them more efficiently without creating barriers to access, fully support that. But at the end of the day, as a system in this city of Toronto, where we are so proud of the diversity and the languages spoken in our schools, there is no way I want to compromise these programs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, through the chair. I have an adult school in my district, and had an opportunity to learn a little bit about how it works over the last few months. So in the same line of questions as the previous speaker, fully in support of being able to continue to provide the programs, but also wanted to clarify a couple of things that I bumped into. So the pay scale is different for the instructors. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, could you?
The
repeat
pay
que-
scale?
The pay scale, yes. Yes. For the adult day school teachers, they are paid on an hourly basis, and there is greater parity to their colleagues in the regular day school, but they are paid on an hourly basis for the work that they conduct. They're not salaried.
Okay, and we're also not beholden to some of the same controls, provincial controls, in terms of how many students are in each classroom. Is that correct?
Through you, Chair, because the funding is different, we do try to maximize the classes as much as possible. Okay. There is also a pattern of attrition, and in some programs, some of the classes, there's less attrition than others. So we do begin with a larger class size because we were not restricted by the class sizes that regular day school teachers conduct. But on average, we aspire to have approximately 35 students in a class, because that's close to what we can get in order to try to maximize the funding that we receive.
Okay, so there's already a process of maximizing of resources that's been in place for some years, bigger class sizes, and the contractual obligations are different already, right?
Through you, Chair, yes.
Okay.
There are different criteria that do apply for adult day schools relative to regular day schools.
Okay. So in terms of us being able to maximize further efficiencies, how much may that affect in-class learning to continue to expand the classes over time and things of that nature?
Thank you for that. Through the chair, adult day schools provide not only credit-based courses, they also provide specialty programs. For example, training to become a personal support worker, a hairdresser, a medical assistant. So although they're all part of the same package, class sizes do vary. But where we can try to maximize, we do obviously look at trying to find that system average across the school so that it does match a certain level of funding. But our classes do vary depending on the programs. But as I said earlier, our effort has always been to try to maximize the classes. The pandemic caused disruptions. Whereas prior to the pandemic, there were more consistent practices to looking at class sizes, But since the pandemic, it was really about serving any adults that were interested in maintaining credits or attaining credits during the pandemic. Now that we are more or less out of the pandemic, and looking into next year, we are definitely addressing the class sizes in as many different ways as possible to find that efficient level so that we can try to minimize the deficit that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you. And last comment is to just pass forward the comments from some of the students in the program. Again, only speaking to one of our facilities, but class size was definitely one of their concerns in terms of their ability to be able to learn in an environment that was productive. So it's something to keep in mind. I understand the pressures, I understand what we're going through, and I appreciate the last 2-3 years have been difficult, but we're probably reaching some level of ceiling in terms of what we're able to do to continue to effectively continue these courses. Thank you.
There's nobody online. Okay, thank you. So I'll pass the chair.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. So I have a couple questions. First, do we not have is there not an external funding source for the adult credit day schools? Is that funded based on fees?
Through you, Chair. For the adult day schools, which provide the credits, that's based on the GSN. Whereas adult ESL that are non-credit, that comes from a different ministry. So the funding source is different there.
Oh, okay. So okay. It's just not. It's missing from the chart.
Oh,
The box on the chart is.
Apologies. Thank you.
Yeah, it says there's revenue, but didn't say where it was coming from. Okay, so it appears, looking at this chart in the different categories, it appears that the pieces that are educational and career-based that are funded through the Ministry of Education are running with funding gaps, whereas the one that's funded by programs that are funded by, the Ministry of Labor is fully funded for the actual costs. As we go forward, I would like to understand how we circle back with the Ministry of Education to point out that they're not funding the full costs. Like infrastructure and needs of the program are always going to be there. They need to fund those as well. Then my other question is, in the elementary international languages, why is the gap between the funding and the cost so big? Like the other ones are percentage, a lot of it is, I understand salary differences, which would be the same as everything else in education for us. But why, like the funded cost for elementary languages, or sorry, the operating cost is almost twice as much as the funding. So, sorry, why is that one so big? Do we charge fees for international languages? I know a lot of them are after school programs.
So through you, Chair, I will try my very best at a level that I know that I understand it. So to answer your first question, is there a charge? Yes, there is a $20 materials fee per student, and it can only be used for instructional supplies. It can't be used for anything beyond that. So it doesn't impact on the bottom line here. As for the costs involved, there has been, it really is that disconnect between the way that we're funded and the costs involved in holding a site. So as Associate Director Sarisco had mentioned, there are approximately 150 sites across TDSB after school on Saturdays. And when those sites are being held, we're trying to meet the needs of the various communities across the city. The expectation by the ministry is that if there are 20 or more, up to 23, requests for a particular language, we're expected to offer that language as long as there's an instructor. So it's possible that, 2-3 classes might be held in one site, and then because of that, we try to put a clerical person there. We pay costs to have that program after school. Permitting, caretaking, those are costs that are part of the overall costs that you see here. Now, to be more efficient, part of the work that we're going to try to do next year is, can we consolidate some of those locations so that we can save on some of the human resources that would be involved. That's what we're going to look at more diligently. But I think that our response has been to try to meet the needs of communities that are asking for these languages to be served wherever we can across the city.
If I may continue with supporting the answer through you, Chair Arts. Other district school boards have a different model where the reduction in the number of days in the week and the site locations are more limited so that the gap isn't as significant. So it really will be, to Trustee Laskin's point, a consideration for the board.
Okay, so can someone remind me when we're expecting more information on this as staff work through efficiencies and looking at the models?
Thank you, and through you. Staff, as part of this year's budget development process, worked with Associate Director Zucker to identify immediate reductions that would be able to take place, and that was approximately $600,000, Trustee Arts. What we have committed to as a small but mighty team is to be working deeply to review all of the specifications that we've outlined to you to make recommendations for reducing the deficit. And that will be over the course of next year in time for next year's budget cycle, so that we are making those decisions in keeping with next year's budget, knowing that we are entering year 3 of the deficit recovery plan. So we'll be able to hopefully help the board get to balance.
I'm not going to put this to a motion, but may I make a friendly suggestion that this come sooner in the budget process than later? That would give us a chance to go to the ministry to say, we've done this work to make the program as efficient as possible, but these are still the gaps that we have in the funding, and this is where it's costing us money. I think it needs to be specific, because it really does, from this chart, from the high-level overview, appear that everything that's being funded through the Ministry of Education, the funding is not covering all the expenses. I get consolidation to make some efficiencies, but I know the last time we did that, there was a lot of outcry about accessing the programs. Not simply, nobody likes change, but not simply about change, but where the programs were located, how people were going to get to them, things like that. So we're a big city. It's hard to travel around. We can't consolidate to the point that people can't get to the, kids can't get to the programs. I know that they work best when the kids have them, at a local school or, close to home. So consolidation is only going to be able to go so far if we're going to maintain equity of access. So I would suggest that, I don't know. what works out. I don't want to put pressure on the work itself, but that, Christmas time, or sorry, winter time, well in advance of the ministry's budget coming out, that we would be able to go to them and say, we've done all this work and your funding is still falling short in these areas.
Thank you. And through you, we'll work closely with Associate Director Zucker. I know that she is wanting to engage all departments very early on in the year to be meeting the needs of trustees.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Trustee Shan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have, so just to confirm, the $6 million deficit primarily comes from two areas, the adult school and the international languages and heritage program, right? Majority of it. Am I correct in assuming that?
Through you, Chair, that is correct, Trustee Shan.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we heard something different. My understanding for international languages classes, many of them happen right after school, starting at somewhere, 3:30-ish. So is that fairly common? Because it makes it difficult for multiple school students to kind of, consolidation is not that possible if parents have to pick up their children from somewhere else and bring them back. So is there any data on what is the start time on these programs? I know it may vary, but is there a general idea of when these are being offered?
Through you, through you, Chair. So Trustee Shan, we do have that data. I just don't have that data with me. I apologize. I will say that in most of the after-school programs, they tend to be after school for that reason, as you mentioned. It is easier, certainly, for families and students to transition from their day school, walk over to the next classroom, and begin their international language instruction. Having said that, it isn't the case everywhere because there are still some sites where students from neighboring schools might be walking over. Therefore, the program might be starting a little bit later, for example, at 4 o'clock going until 6:30. Each of these programs are 2.5 hours. But I can endeavor to certainly find that data for you, Trustee Shan, and at the next Trustees Weekly, we can share that information with you if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I'm also, so in a situation like this where we have salaries and benefits for positions that are needed not being met by the provincial funding, would increased enrollment in these programs address the issue of the deficit, or increased enrollment would just proportionally increase the deficit?
Through you, Chair. To some extent, that would help to reduce deficit, but we also know that not every classroom is going to have their full amount of students midway through the program or even by the end of the program. Students, we do need to begin with the 20 to 23 students in a classroom, but there are times in which life circumstances for students may change. Therefore, if they withdraw, and there's still a core number of students, as well as we've passed the date in which classes can be closed according to the collective agreement, then those classes will remain. Therefore, we might still be paying for that instructor to be there, but with a smaller number of students. Thank you.
So, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. So potentially, if the enrollment in heritage classes and international languages classes, which is a name I struggle with, international languages classes and heritage classes, say hypothetically, if the enrollment goes up by 30% or 35% in the next 2-3 way to eliminate deficit?
Through you, Chair, I apologize. It was hard for me to clearly hear that. If you wouldn't mind repeating, Trustee Shan?
Yeah. So hypothetically, if the enrollment in these international languages as well as the heritage classes go up by 30 or 40% in the next 3 years. Would that make the deficit become much less? Because my question is that if the enrollment is met with the same kind of funding formula, would that still continue with the deficit? Or if you see that from the organizational point of view, some of the deficit is around, number of classes per administrative cost and so on. Would you see the deficit becoming lower if the enrollment was to go up?
Thank you. And through the chair, to you, Trustee Shan, the answer to the question, from my understanding, it's not as simple as it being a proportional reduction. And part of that is because there are many variables involved. As I had mentioned earlier, with examples, there might be sites that that have small number of classes, and then there are sites, for example, Saturday program, where you might have 20 classes with only 2 or 3 support staff. That's an example of something quite efficient. But because we are trying to balance that with community needs, we're trying to balance that with meeting the needs of equity of access, there are going to be different models that we would have to look at to try to find those efficiencies to try to answer that question. So it isn't a direct correlation between reduction of students to the reduction of the deficit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. My reasoning is that at least in certain languages we've seen a bit of reduction in certain languages. Generally, like, I don't think we are actively promoting these programs as we used to in the past. Maybe it's seen as a burden on our budget, as opposed to something that will help to alleviate the budget. So that's the part I'm struggling with, whether us going out and increasing the demand for these programs, if that's going to help us, because I do see a lot more access, a lot more participation could benefit both the communities, as Trustee Laskin mentioned, in terms of their self-esteem around their languages, their intergenerational connection to their families, and so on, and self-esteem in their schoolwork. And including learning another language such as English in a more proficient way. So I don't know if I haven't seen much. I used to see it a lot more in the past many years back. These programs was celebrated as some of the highlights of our board, but I don't see it anymore. Maybe that is part of the consideration around budget that's driving it. But if there is a possibility of increased enrollment, can create less strain on this, that's something to consider rather than cutting the program further to non-existence. For adults, that those programs and to be clear, those programs are either breaking even or making a little bit of money, right? Those programs that are non-credit adult night programs and so on that are being offered.
Sorry, Trustee Shan, are you still with us? Your feed cut out.
Yeah. I was just asking. Sorry, I was just asking if the programs that offer the interest courses for adults, that program is continuing to make money, right? Or is the neutral, right?
Maybe needs to text it.
I'm sorry, Trustee Shannon. We didn't really understand your question.
That's okay. I think I'm good. I'm almost at the end of the time. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, if you want to send it by text, please feel free. Just your feed cut out a few times there.
Through the chair.
Next on the list.
Sorry, through the chair, if I may just add one,
Yes, go
if I
ahead,
may,
sorry.
I apologize. I just wanted to try to answer a little bit to what Trustee Shan was mentioning, which is if possibly there was higher enrollment, could that help to lower the deficit? That's kind of what I thought I heard as a possibility. The greatest challenge that is faced in the international languages program is the fact that there is a significant gap between what we're funded and what we pay our instructors. So even if we had more classes, we would still then be paying the instructors their deserved salary. So that gap is still going to be there for them, even though we may have a higher enrollment. So there is a significant gap between how we're funded and what we pay our instructors. So having more students doesn't really address the need right now to reducing the deficit. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And through the chair, the second part of the question that I thought I heard was that, or a comment that our general interest programs were making money. And I just want to say that we do have a $600,000 deficit currently in our general interest programs, but that has been proposed in the options to balances, which is why you're not seeing it here, because our assumption is that in 23-24 that we will see the general interest courses break even. If that were not passed this evening, then there would be an additional deficit of 600,000 for general interest courses.
Okay, next on the list, we have trustee pay. Trustee Pay, you're on mute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, may I ask as the Superintendent, Mr. Chang, repeat the deficit again? I didn't get a clear number. So I think for adult school, that says amount to $300,000. Can you just give me the number, please?
For which, sorry, which?
Yeah, for mine, so for adult school, another one for international language. I just want to know the number.
Those are different programs.
I know, I understand. I wanted those numbers, deficit numbers.
Okay, so that was in the report, that's in eScribe, but I can get staff to run through the deficit amounts for each of the different programs as a reminder, in just the summary deficit amounts?
Yes, that's correct, yes. Please.
Sorry, if I could clarify through you, Chair, the summary deficit amounts?
Sorry, the deficit, not all the numbers in the chart, but the deficit amounts for each program?
For each program. Elementary International Languages and African Heritage trustee pay is $3,339,391.
Okay, so 3.3 million, okay.
Administration is $799,000, sorry, $799,144. Adult Credit Day School is $2,238,610.
Okay.
Do you want me to go on? Sorry.
No, that's more than enough. Okay. I just felt like the number is really huge. I understand that, Madam Chair, we can always ask, the province to jump in to give us money, but we really need to get our house in order. I think the staff really need to sharpen their pencils and bring costs under control. The bottom line is we're needed to be more efficient in our operations. So through your chair, I want to ask the staff that is how the enrollment number has been reflected. This is a cost increase. So what's the enrollment number in the past few years? Do they come down or they go up with the deficit that much?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? That wasn't clear.
Yeah, so I want to ask the enrollment number for last few years, compare the deficit we have right now. I just want to understand the operating cost. Did the operating cost goes up or stays same or goes down with the enroll numbers going up or down? I just want to see any correlation regarding enrollment number and the cost.
Okay, so does the cost of the program go up or down with enrollment numbers?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Arts, this may be a question, Trustee Pei, that we would need to analyze. As Superintendent Chang indicated, it is complicated. I'm sure that there's an algorithm for us to be analyzing the ratio between enrollment and deficit. In order for us to find as many efficiencies as possible, we need to be having our classes as close to the cap as possible so that we don't trip another cost of an instructor for a very low class size. The main driver of why there is a deficit, Trustee Pei, through the chair, is the differential between our salary and benefit, as is negotiated centrally, compared to the funding. That is less than the salary and benefit. That is the main driver of the deficit.
Okay, so, without the correlation, how do we know we're really working efficiently on this case? I mean, without the correlation between the enrollment number and the accounting staffs, because we always allocated our staff according to our enrollment in other program, right? Why is not the case here?
Through the chair, maybe I can help a little bit. So as indicated, one of our major differences between that is causing the deficit is the difference between our cost, TDSB's cost for staffing versus what we're funded from the Ministry of Education. And so if we do increase our staffing numbers, then we increase our deficit because the gap grows as we increase the number of staff. If there's a gap for one staff, then obviously if there's 10 staff, the gap is higher. And I think what you're hearing is that we need to find an optimum number of enrollment that would be able to offset the costs, but not trigger an additional staff. Because when we add staff, we increase our deficit, because even though we're funded, we're not funded for the entire amount.
So, okay, Associate Zachary, why we're not, funded with that amount? Is also, I have a question regarding the non-instructional staff. Are these funded by the program too?
Yeah, thank you. And through the chair, I think that you'll find a lot of our deficits are as a result of what we pay our staff based on collective agreements is higher than what the ministry is funding us, and therefore that causes a deficit. And so this employee group is not different than many of our other employee groups that also are being paid more than we're funded for. And again, because it's done through collective agreement, there isn't really anything that TDSB can do about it, and it would require the ministry to increase their benchmarks.
Okay, I understand their salary and benefit, but what the numbers? I mean, have you ever calculated there's an efficient number to do such administrative stuff instead of certain number we currently have now? Because I just want to find out where's the efficient there, right? There got to be some kind of efficiency. If we say we have a certain student, annual number is going down, then the supporting staff or administrative staff, the number should go down as well, right?
Yes, and thank you. And through the chair, I think that's the intended work that will happen in the fall, is that we will be looking at those ratios to determine if there's an more efficient way to offer these programs while still continuing to provide the support to students as indicated by some of your colleagues around the table tonight.
Yeah, my next question, why is it waiting for a fall, not happening right now? Because we're dealing with the biggest deficit. Why the work is not being done beforehand? Why was it waiting in the fall?
So I'll answer that question. This was discussed at our last meeting. So this was a motion put forward by Trustee Lee at our last meeting and then accepted at board last week that outlines the information that he was looking for and a timeline for the work to be done. This is not work that can be done overnight. This is work that's going to have to look at the programs over 6 months. So we all voted on this timeline last week.
Okay, to be honest, I really want to see this report because without the correlation regarding the enrollment number and the staff number, it's really hard for me to understand why we have this big, huge, like a deficit, right? We really need to work efficiently. I mean, we cannot just beg a province for money forever, right? Because most time it doesn't happen. I really think we need to keep our house in order first. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Do we have anyone else on the? No, seeing no further questions. Thank you very much, staff, for this report. I'm looking forward to more work going forward. And I need a mover and a seconder, or do you have another question? I need a mover and a seconder to receive the report. So if
James Lee moves, please. Thank you.
Oh,
McLean will second.
We'll take the people online. So Trustee Lee, Trustee McLean, thank you very much. Could we open the vote, please?
I'm in favor.
Lee is in favor.
Chair Wong is in favor.
Trustee David is in favor.
And, okay, oh. I don't think so. Okay, so that carries. Thank you. So we'll go back to our delegation for this evening. So our delegate for the evening is Mr. John Weatherup. And welcome, John. You know the drill.
Yes, I'm John Weatherup, and I'm the president of the Toronto Education Workers Local 4400. And I'm before the trustees again. I think the last time I was here live in person was probably in 2019, giving the same speech. And at the time, I referred it to Fantasyland because some of the things that we're doing here seem to be similar. So I took the time to look at the 23-24 drivers for strategic planning, and I looked at the student safety and mental health and well-being. And the first one up is prioritize student safety, security, and well-being of student staff by ensuring the appropriate supports in place. Those supports are not in place this school year, they weren't in place last school year, and they'll be worse next school year. I don't take that lightly, but you may want to ask for a copy of the Ministry of Labor's report out of Fairmeadow on May 30th that lists all the safety issues that the board has violated, including staff and students around, and particularly around special ed violence. So when the board goes through with these changes, they should understand that the supports don't exist now, and there'll be even less supports with the spec ed cuts that they're making. They talk about considering the long-term impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on student mental health and well-being. As we well know, thousands of kindergarten students went in through COVID with little or no educational being done because at that young age, it's almost impossible to do it over Zoom or online. Those kids are going through grades 1, 2, and 3, and the supports were not put in place. In fact, you're laying off about 35 DECs who could provide that support as they move through the older grades. Review the current service model to prevent and address community and school violence. I think that's pretty clear that we're not, and we actually know both in spec ed violence and what I refer to vandal violence across our schools, that's not being met at all. I go to the staff allocation and support all students. Align staffing resources to support student and safety, mental health and well-being, both in schools across TDSB workplace. We're not doing it in last year's budget, and we're not going to be doing it in this year's budget. Hire qualified staff who represent and identify with school communities they serve. As we know, we can't hire staff in a number of job categories, and it's almost virtually impossible to hire temporary employees. So I want you to imagine this. There's a safety plan in a school that requires 3 or 4 staff members to be in the school. And in fact, there's about a 40 to 50% fill rate for EAs. Those safety plans cannot even be implemented because there is not the staff in schools to do it currently. Those are the board's numbers. You can check with staff about the fill rates for spec ed EAs, what happens in congregated sites. Those issues are all there. Align staffing resources to support the plan itself. Well, I'll leave you with that because you're taking staff out of the system and not putting it in. Just to go to the caretaking numbers, there's the 2 numbers the board refers to. They refer to the COVID numbers. I'm not sure that we're still out of COVID. I'm not sure our school should be taking out for doing the cleaning. Not only is it COVID-related issues in our schools, as we learned after we came out of COVID, there's a number of other health issues that crop up in our schools due to hygiene and cleanliness, whether it's the flu season and other things. So those staff coming out on the COVID side, COVID's not over. We have one of our stewards who just came down with COVID today. They're not gone, and we're actually going to start removing. And I get it. It's the province. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here to I understand how the funding formula works, understanding Ford. Doug Ford's using this board again. I mean, the Need to Succeed campaign, and Shelley Laskin was around when we had that debate, and telling the government that they need to make their own cuts. They're getting the trustees to do their dirty work, and everybody knows it, but we go through this process, and so I have 1 minute left. So the elementary schools, the Safe Arrival program, so we're getting rid of elementary school secretaries where we talk about safety. I've already been through the early childhood educators. And when you go to the Education Act, because everybody loves to quote the Education Act in these times, right? What is the penalty for trustees? What happens if you don't pass a balanced budget? But if you read the responsibilities of trustees, it's for the safety and well-being of students. It's also that all our buildings are in good repair. You'll find it all in the Education Act. We're not delivering on any of those. We talk about billions of dollars in shortfall for repairs. We know we're not providing safety in schools for our students. And so under the Education Act, there's 2 points, and I get the legal problem. The government's never put any teeth in place to say you have to keep children safe. It's not anything legally that you have to keep schools in good repair. All they're worrying about is whether you're going to balance the budget, which comes from a government that doesn't have to balance a budget, as you currently know, is sitting on $22 billion that they could actually be spending, but doesn't need it. I understand the legalities of it, but you cannot go through this like you're whistling by the graveyard, not understanding the impacts that are currently in our system. Thank you.
Thank you. So now questions from trustees. Each trustee has 3 minutes. So go ahead, Shelley.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, I remember it. Well, I actually still have PTSD from 2002. So you're telling us that you would rather have Ford do the cuts. So do you not want a locally elected board?
Say that again.
I said you said to us that we should just let the government do its own dirty work. So is that advocating for getting rid of locally elected school boards?
I think Doug Ford, if he wants to get rid of the school boards, it won't because of the TDSB doesn't pass a balanced budget, like he did with Bill 98 and like he's done with the healthcare budgets, like he did on putting our members on the street. I don't think he is, if he wants to put the trustee, like get rid of the trustees in the province of Ontario, Doug Ford will do that without, it won't matter what you do here. And if you're put under administration, and there was a number of times our board has had administrators and you're looking at the books. And every time that I remember they looked at the books, they found that the shortfalls were greater and they actually put money in. I can tell you outdoor education, the swimming pools with Marguerite Jackson. I can tell you about the money that was put back into the system after these types of occurrences. Because when they're forced to look at what you're looking at, they make different decisions. And you're looking at it from, what the repercussions are for you. And I get that and I understand that. I've, like I said, been through a number of boards with this same debate. We go through this and you say, is it democratic elected? Bill 98, they're starting to take more of your authority away. They're going to take away how you sell properties. What the trustees can do is being restricted. pretty soon it gets to a point that why have elected trustees if they're not going to get you the authority to take care of staff, students, and parents?
Thank you very much. You and I have very different recollections of the facts.
I think I could go back, Shelley, we'll pull out the reports on what money was put back into the boards.
I'm happy to do that with you.
I know you are, Shelley.
Okay, thank you very much for coming
Thank you.
today. So that we only had the one delegation today. So our next item on the agenda is 4.2, which is the 2023-2024 final budget estimates. And am I handing that to you? You are. So take it away, Associate Director Zucker.
Thank you, and through the chair, we are really pleased to bring this budget forward to trustees today for recommendation to the board. This has been a culmination of almost 6 months of work, and I don't think I need to tell anybody at this table that because you've all been here as well. But I just want to appreciate the work and the thought that's gone into it, and I think you'll see through this presentation the effort that has been made to comply with our deficit recovery plan, and also to ensure that we are minimizing the impact on students as best as possible. So again, as we go through this, you're not going to see anything new here tonight, but I think it's important for us to just walk through it and to make sure that we can answer any questions that you may have. So the first thing that I just wanted to go through were the timelines, and I mentioned how long and how much work we have done through this. But again, the budget timelines, we started in January with our enrollment projections and have been working through the Finance, Budget, and Enrollment Committees to get to today where we are recommending to the board, again, our operating budget as you see it tonight. So with regards to balancing the budget, boards are required to submit a balanced budget per Section 231 of the Education Act. And under the regulation, the board can have a deficit of up to 1% and up to the maximum reserve balance. And so that's an important part of this as well. And for that, we don't have to require permission from the ministry. And for us, 1% is approximately 28 million. However, last year, the board had a deficit of 1.4%, and that required approval from the ministry for the deficit. And as part of the approval, the board provided a 3-year deficit recovery plan. So we're in year 2 of that plan, and that plan commits us to a $15.1 million deficit for 23-24. So that 15.1, that's where it comes from, and that's where you'll see that staff has done the work to provide the recommendations to get us to that $15.1 million. As we know, the board has been operating with a structural deficit, meaning that we're spending more each year than we receive in revenue over the last number of years. And this has resulted in a deficit on an annual basis, which uses up our accumulated reserves. And I'll liken that to every year we're making less money than we're spending, and we're dipping into our savings account each year, and we have hit the bottom of that savings account, and we're actually using our line of credit, basically, if the board were a person. So during the pandemic, the board also did use an additional $69 million in reserves to support student safety and staff safety. And we know that the board has been advocating for the return of this funding. That wouldn't help us in our structural deficit, meaning it wouldn't help us on an annual basis, but it would allow us to have a $69 million additional in our reserve balance to help us to move through annual deficits that come up. As a result, and at the end of 2021-22, as a result of the structural deficits, the board has used all of its working fund reserves, so meaning our reserves that don't have any particular requirements attached to them. And we are also borrowing or using some of our internal reserves. So we do need to balance our budget, again, in order not to continue to use our internal reserves and to build up our working fund reserve. Again, that would be like us going paycheck to paycheck if we were a person without having any kind of savings whatsoever in case there were some sort of emergencies. So we do need to have a working fund balance in order to be able to deal with any emergencies that come up. So this is just a chart which we've all seen before to show, and this comes from our financial statements, that we have had working fund reserves all along, even though we've had a deficit, an accumulated deficit for accounting purposes. We've always had working fund reserves, and meaning that we've always had money in the bank to help us when we had annual deficits. After 21-22, so in August of 2022, we do not have any working fund reserve. And if you look at our internal reserve balance, the other number that's highlighted in yellow, you'll see that we went from 179 million to 90 million. And again, that is us using some of that in order to help us balance in the previous year. So when we look at our budget for 2023-24, what I want to do is just outline our projected revenues, our projected expenses, and then look at how we are balancing the two or getting to the $15.1 million. So our projected revenue for 23-24 is approximately 3.3 million, and you'll see that most of that 3.1 million is coming from the grant for student needs. And so again, the grant for student needs is what the ministry, how the ministry provides us most of our funding. It is mostly dependent on enrollment. It's enrollment usually times some sort of benchmark. And again, it's projected to be $3.1 billion in 23-24. So because it's enrollment based, those enrollment projections are very important. And I just want to do a shout out to our planning and enrollment department. COVID has been a difficult time to project enrollment. Prior to COVID, the numbers have been very, very close from a projection to our actuals. And so as we come out of the pandemic and our enrollment starts to stabilize and there aren't as many factors that are impacting it that are COVID related, we do believe that our 23-24 projected enrollment is a reasonable estimate of our enrollment moving forward. And you'll see that overall, it's a decrease of 200 students, so basically 0.1%. So as our enrollment stabilizes, the grant for student needs also stabilizes. So obviously, though, if it were increasing, then our grants would be increasing. Correspondingly, when it's decreasing, the grants go down. So the fact that our enrollment is pretty much the same, expected to be the same from the current year that we're in to next year, we would expect, all things being equal, the grants to be approximately the same. And this just highlights our grant for student needs and how it's allocated. As we know, it comes in the form of many allocations. The Pupil Foundation grant, which is the biggest blue section, is where we get most of our funding related to the classroom. So it will be your classroom teachers, it will be any of the resources that we use in the classroom, DECEs, our supply costs, that sort of thing. The next biggest slice is the gray slice that you see at the bottom, and that's our special education allocation. So when we look at special education, again, we know that a significant portion of it is based on our overall enrollment, how we receive that funding, and that this grant does supplement our Pupil Foundation allocation to help us to provide special education supports to our students. And it does make up 11% of the GSN. The dark gray piece at the top is our school operations allocation, again, 9%. And that relates to all of the costs to operate our schools, not the capital costs, but the operating costs. So it includes our caretakers, it includes any sort of repairs and maintenance that are done on a daily basis. It includes utilities and the costs to operate our buildings. The green slice, which is another 9%, that's our teacher qualification allocation. And that means that in the blue slice, the Pupil Foundation allocation, we receive funding based on the average costs of teachers or the average benchmark. And then what we do is we get an additional allocation based on the experience and the qualifications of our teachers. So as we have more qualified teachers and more experienced teachers, we obviously pay them more than the average, and this grant is intended to make up that difference. It does not, though, account for the difference between TDSB's grid and the province's grid. So that's where we will see some differences. Again, going back to the conversation in the Con Ed report, that our salaries in many cases are higher than the provincially bargained and funded collective agreements. The school foundation allocation is the last piece that I'll talk about. It's the small orange slice on the bottom. It's about 6%, and this pays for the administration at schools. So it pays for our principals, our vice principals, our school office administration. And so that makes up the majority of the slices that you see here. For the most part, though, these slices are not specifically spent in these areas and not required to be spent in these areas. They're not, we use the word enveloped or sweatered, meaning that we don't have to spend them in the areas. And so when we look at the budget as a whole, we're looking at where does all the funding come from and how do we support all the students of TDSB with the funding that we receive. For highlights for the GSN, when we're comparing this year to next year, we did release the GSN was released on April 17th, which again is later in the year than it has been in the past. So there's been a lot of work done since that time, but some of the key changes that were identified, there's a new transportation funding model that has had a positive impact for TDSB. So again, the ministry kept the funding for transportation the same across the province, but reallocated it. And so there were some boards that will receive more funding that they've received in the past, and there are a number of boards that are receiving less funding that they've received in the past. And TDSB is one of those boards that is receiving more funding, so that does help us to balance our budget. There is funding for remote learning administration, and it's not necessarily new funding because that funding was provided through the COVID learning recovery funds previously. So again, we are still receiving that funding because we are still providing remote learning, and we do have to have administration associated with remote learning, but we are receiving funding accordingly. The issue with that is the province has removed those remote students in the calculations related to anything school operations related. So the funding that we receive for utilities, caretakers, all of the things that support our schools, the remote students are no longer included in that calculation. The realignment of Indigenous education funding, again, it's similarly to transportation. Some boards received more funding and some received less. And TDSB is receiving more funding, but again, as a result of the decisions made at this board for the grade 11 English, and when we're looking at our enrollments in Indigenous classes next year, that's been taken into account, and that does help us. The most significant increase in the GSN are the labor-related changes. So the ministry has included in the GSN funding to support teaching staff and our school support staff, and the school support staff being mostly CUPE, they are, the additional funding there is about $1 an hour. And for our teaching staff, the ministry has included a 1.25% increase. So as you know, when this funding is provided, there's also an increase in the costs associated with it. So this additional funding does not help us to balance the budget. And again, that is the majority of the increases that we will see. In addition, there were some temporary or priorities and partnership funding grants, PPF grants, that were one-time grants originally that have been moved into the GSN. So what that means is the funding hasn't changed. It's just become a little bit more permanent, meaning that there's a commitment to that funding on an annual basis, but there's no additional funding to help us balance the budget. In addition, The non-staff benchmarks for school operations, so again, the operating of our schools has increased by 2%. But we all know that the 2%, for example, our utilities are increasing by about 6.5%. So 2% is not making up that difference as a result of mostly inflation. So it helps us to bridge that gap, but the gap is still widening based on inflation. So those are just some of the highlights related to the GSN changes. In addition, and probably the biggest change and the biggest impact that you're seeing on staffing anyways, is the discontinuation of the COVID Learning Recovery Fund. And I know we've talked about this a lot, but I think it's really important for us just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Again, in 21-22 and 22-23, we did receive temporary funding to support learning recovery. The funding was discontinued in 23-24. For TDSB specifically, it equals 522 positions, $31.5 million. And again, through this budget process that started in January, 99 of those positions have been included in the 23-24 budget. So what that means, though, is that those 99 positions aren't funded in any way. So in order to offset those positions, additional reductions need to be made in order to have a balanced budget. So the next slide shows specifically those positions, but again, we had 522 positions. We've added back, or we have kept 99 of those positions to be funded through the GSN now. And the total reductions are 423 positions. And so again, when we get into the expenditures and we start to look at the reductions, a lot of those reductions relate to these 423 positions. The next funding area is our other ministry grants. Most of them come from our priorities and partnership funding, or the PPF. This is a supplemental grant to the GSN. And again, as I mentioned, it's one-time funding. Each year, the ministry releases a list of the PPFs that they are providing and tell us, usually through a pretty tight agreement, how we should spend that funding. And so key changes for this year, again, the ministry had $4.5 million in math strategy PPF that's been discontinued. However, there's a new math recovery plan, which is approximately the same amount. So we're supporting math with the same dollar amounts and a little bit differently. The intention is to have more direct support for students and specific students. The ministry is identifying the schools where this funding can be spent. In addition, you'll see that we are receiving new funding to support early reading and reading intervention, offset by a little bit of a discontinuation. And then we are receiving $11 million of new funding to support de-streaming and transition to high school. And again, in all of these instances, we're either awaiting more detail to determine how that funding should be spent exactly. And in some cases, based on how the funding is identified, what it's for, we already have existing expenses that we are able to use this funding to support, meaning that that does help us to balance by being able to offset some of our existing costs with this PPF, with all of the PPFs. The next area is miscellaneous revenue, and it's a small component of revenue, but it does include our permanent revenue, lease revenue, interest revenue, international student fees. And again, during COVID, we saw a number of decreases in these grants, and there were limitations and restrictions in place, whether it be travel restrictions for international students, whether it be the use of community spaces in order to increase our permit revenues. So as we move out of the pandemic, those revenues have started to increase again to pre-pandemic levels. We certainly still will expect in future years additional money to come in, especially related to our international students, but we do see this as an important piece coming out of the pandemic to help us to return to those levels. With regards to expenditures, again, our total projected expenditures are about $3.3 billion. Instructional expenditures making up most of it, 81%. Our building and operations and maintenance, 13%. Transportation, 2%. Administration, 2%, and other, 2%. And I think the important thing to understand when we're looking at this is that there is not a lot of wiggle room to make reductions to the budget without impacting some sort of program or service. And just wanted to highlight that when you look at, our discretional expenses that are not salary related, that are not program related, are very small. And trustees around the table will know that we have gone here year after year after year on that other category to try to, again, make reductions to our budget without having a significant impact on schools and students and staffing. So it is getting harder to be able to balance without being able to have that impact. When we look here at our estimated expenditures, this is just to really outline that the green and the blue, that's salaries and wages and employee benefits. That makes up 87% of our total budget. So again, quite a significant number. So we have had some changes in staffing, and you will see them for 3 main reasons. One is a reduction in positions funded by one-time funding, mostly the COVID funding, those 423 positions. We have had an increase or a decrease in projected enrollment, and so that does impact things like the number of classroom teachers that we have. For example, if our enrollment goes up in a certain grade, then our number of teachers will go up. Similarly, if it goes down, then the number of teachers go down because it's based on class size. We also have made a few reductions in positions as a result of decisions to support balancing the budget. So some of them were made and approved through school-based staffing, and some of them we've talked about here that are to be approved in finality through this process. So the chart on the next page, and before I get there, I apologize, it's really small, but trustees should have a copy of it, and you should be able to see it on your screen as well. It's an important chart, and it's really, really small. But what you will see is when we look at the reductions in classroom teachers, again, our enrollment is relatively similar from 22, 23 to 23, 24. So you would expect not a significant change, and that's what we're seeing. Overall, a decrease of 4 teachers, and again, we're talking about over 15,000, so that's a very small change. When we look at additional changes for our school administration, and as we look down at those differences, the majority of those differences relate to the decrease in COVID funding. And so, again, it's a decrease in funding. It does have an impact. But if we look back at the numbers in 2019, 2020, before we received this COVID funding, you would see very similar or even lower numbers. Continuing education, right now, we've left it the same. It's hard to determine an FTE because it's based on the number of hours that people work. So as we work through that calculation, we will have a more definitive number there. But again, it's based on enrollment and the number of instructors that we have. Board admin and governance, we have talked about the fact that this is where we have gone in many previous years to make reductions, but it is still important to continue to review all of our staffing. And so there is a reduction of 4 that you will see here. School operations, and again, this would be our caretaking and all of the supports to support our school the operation of our schools. And that is a decrease of about 120 or 130. And that, again, mostly relates to the COVID recovery positions. So when we look at our staffing totals, we do see a reduction of 460 positions. Mostly, if not solely, and I will not make that 100% commitment, but I believe through attrition. So I think that's important, although we do see a reduction in our numbers, the impact that it has on people's employment with TDSB has not significantly changed, if at all. And I can look to my employee services staff to confirm that later through questions if we have them. When we look at the rest of our projected expenditures, and this is one of the appendices to the report, just has the dollars instead of the decimal points, but they're the same numbers. You will see increases in classroom teachers, and this is a result of, one, increases in the GSN funding for labor, so that 1.25% and the dollar per education worker. You'll see decreases related to the COVID Learning Recovery Fund decreases, and you'll see some decreases related to some budget decisions that we've made. And there are also, just like in revenue, we don't have all of the PPF's information yet, so we don't have the revenue included. There are also expenditures related to the PPFs that we do not have yet. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples because I think it's important as we look through this chart. When we look at instructional computers, for example, it's a $14 million decrease. Seems very significant, and it is. But $9 million of that relates to the one-to-one device strategy, and another, the remainder of it is mostly related to depreciation. So the capital cost of depreciation is not included in here yet. There is a corresponding revenue that matches. So it doesn't have an impact on the bottom line. It just has an impact on whether or not we've recorded the expenditure yet. So that's why you see some of those differences. Similarly, with continuing education, there's about $7 million in PPFs that we haven't received yet, that once they are added, you will see numbers very similar to next year. So it's not always easy to do a comparison of the revised estimates for 22-23 to the budget projections for 23-24, because there are some things that get announced throughout the year that are not yet included in the estimates. But again, what you'll see are increases related to the salary increases. You'll see decreases related to any of the proposed options to balance or the school-based staffing decisions that we've made. And you will see decreases related to the reduction as a result of the COVID Learning Recovery Fund. But again, when we get to the end, if there are specific ones and you've had a chance to review it through the report, then we'll be happy to answer them specifically. So what you'll see from those expenditures is that it has caused us to have some challenges in 23-24. And they do include the increase in statutory benefits that didn't have a corresponding increase in revenue. It does, if you look at the supply cost, you'll see that those have increased, and those are based on our actual costs. And we know that even this year, our actual costs are higher than our budgeted costs. So that's something that we continue to keep an eye on and look at our monthly reporting that we do to the ministry. And we are seeing increases in replacement costs compared to the budget. We also have inflationary increases. I gave one example of utilities, but there are many others where our contractual obligations, so what we've agreed to in contract, sometimes relates to, say, CPI, and there is not a corresponding increase in revenue. So as those expenditures increase and we're contractually obligated to do those increases, there's not a corresponding increase in revenue. We also did increase our spending related to school safety in 22-23. If you recall, we did some major increases through FBEC in January of 2023. Those are being maintained in this proposed budget for 23-24. So that has created a budget challenge for us as well. And as we saw in the reports that we have provided to FBEC previously, we do spend more in a number of areas than we're funded for. And some of those are listed here, but it is certainly not an exhaustive list. But when you see them, you know that how important those are to supporting the students of TDSB. So special education, lunchroom supervision, student nutrition, outdoor education, again, those are just a few examples of where we do spend more than we are funded for. We just wanted to outline again that there was no increase in the GSN for statutory benefits or costs related to sick leave, and that over the last 5 years, our projected incremental unfunded benefit cost is $47.3 million. And for many of these instances, we do not have control over the expenditures. And I think CPP is a prime example. That is federally provided, the amount that the employer portion is going to be of CPP. And when we don't receive additional funding to offset that cost, then in order to balance, we are looking elsewhere. What I will say about most of these costs, and not that it makes it any better, is that most boards, well, all boards across the province are having similar challenges. Obviously, the large size of TDSB does increase these costs significantly. But again, we're looking at $47.3 million that we have increased our spending where there has been no increase in funding over the last 5 years. So I want to look at our budget drivers. And on March 8th, we did approve the strategic budget drivers to guide the development of the 23-24 budget. The top 6 are listed, and we will talk a little bit more about how this budget is supporting them a little bit later, but I think it's important for us to note that the budget drivers not only help us decide where to make reductions, it also helps us decide where not to make reductions. And that's really important because you can see throughout the budget and through the add backs that were made through the COVID Learning Recovery Fund that the budget drivers were really considered in making those recommendations. So financial position and our proposed options to balance. Again, on February 15th, we did bring a report to FBEC that showed a projected deficit of $61 million. When we did the school-based staffing, when it was approved in March, this increased a further $2.3 million in order to maintain the 40 school-based safety monitors that had been previously funded by COVID. And when the GSN was released, and we were, hopeful that the GSN would provide us some relief for our deficit, it only increased our position by $1.6 million. So again, what this does outline is the pressures existed prior to the GSN being released. They still exist after the GSN being released. And I also want to take this time to give a shout out to the budget team who did the original projections to show, how much work and care and consideration goes into the projections, that it was, within $1.6 million. So after those things were considered, our starting point for the projected deficit is $61.7 million. Just a reminder again, in March, we did approve school-based staffing. It does make up 68% of our board's total budget. It gets approved each March in order to allow schools to prepare for their staffing allocations for the next year. So in order to meet collective agreement timelines and in order to give our principals an opportunity to make sure that they have the time to be able to do their scheduling and their staff allocations, we do approve it at that time. In March, $9.4 million of reductions were approved by the board at that time. Since March, we have added back 8 secondary vice principals and 20 elementary vice principals. 18, so 8 of the secondary and 10 of the elementary vice principals are being funded with one-time funding carried from previous years as a result of us not spending during COVID the same way that we've spent. So again, important to note that this is one-time funding that we are using to cover these positions. And if we were to continue to keep them, and I'm looking to next year, and we don't need to talk about it today, but I just want to put it out there that if we are continuing them in 24, 25, that one-time funding will no longer exist. So that's something where that would create a budget pressure moving forward. In addition, 10 of the elementary vice principal positions were added to the budget. So there's $1.4 million that got added back to to the budget, creating additional deficit. And then in June, the board did approve adding back 6 aquatic instructors. And so that $400,000 was also added to the budget. There was $200,000 of wiggle room, so the $200,000 has been added to our request for proceeds of disposition. So the net decrease in school-based staffing after those add backs is about 7.6 million, and it represents about a 0.4% decrease in school-based staffing. In addition, on June 14th, the board approved a motion to add back the social workers and the CYCs, or the child and youth counselors. That totaled $3.7 million. So if we take our projected deficit position of 61.7 million, we add back the reduction related to school-based staffing that was approved of 7.6 million, and then we take off again the social workers and CYCs that were added back, we get an updated projected deficit of 57.8 million. And so just again, you'll hear the 15.1, and I know we all know it off by heart, but we're trying to get to a $15.1 million position. So we would require further reductions of 42.7 million to get to that 15.1 and to meet the commitment that we made through our deficit recovery plan. So you will not see again anything on here that is new, but just wanted to outline that this is what is being proposed by staff. This is what's been included in the numbers that you have seen previously. The first is the increase in the special incidents portion of the special education allocation. And again, this isn't for new expenditures. This is the fact that we have expenditures that we have that are existing, that we are able to submit claims for, that we have realized that the claims that we've submitted previously could be increased. We did ask for an extension to the deadline to be able to put additional claims in, and that deadline was approved. So staff is currently working through this process, and we'll be working all summer to determine the claims that we can add to support the expenditures that are already existing. Our estimate at this time is an additional $5 million. And again, just so everybody's aware, that's for this current year, right? That's for 22-23 that we would receive additional funding. We know that the ministry announced that the special incidents portion is being reviewed, and so to give them a year to review, they have said that they will take the amount that we have this year and I think increase it by 5% for next year's claim. So that's why you see this, why it's so important for this year to help us, but also for next year to help us as well. And then the impact for 24-25, we're still uncertain because the method may change based on the ministry review. In addition, we are proposing a reduction of 44 teachers. You'll see them listed here. It's approximately 11 per learning center. Also a reduction of centrally assigned principals of 5 for a total proposed reduction. Again, 44 teachers, 5 centrally assigned principals for a reduction of 5.6 million. Again, going back to this is where we go to help us to balance. This is the first place that we go, is to make sure that we are being as efficient as possible in our spending, especially at the central level when we're looking at things like supplies and technology and professional development. So we did ask all of our central budgets to reduce their spending by 5%. In addition, and trustees did mention this, and so staff are reviewing all of our license agreements to determine if anything can be paused or discontinued, whether it be that we are able to do that through our agreements that we have, and that it will not impact our ability to provide services in any way. So that is happening right now. And between those two areas, we're projecting a savings of 1.7 million. General interest courses, and this is what I was referring to earlier, and we've talked about this, but examples do include, pizza making, dance classes, art classes, calligraphy, some languages, but not the languages that we were referring to earlier. Currently, our expenditures exceed our revenues by $600,000, meaning we have a deficit of $600,000 for general interest courses. Our policy says that they should be fully funded by user fees and other revenues. So we will look at ways to fully fund the general interest program for next year, and this can take place for next year. And it will include things like looking at possible fee increases, looking at the subsidies that we provide, and things like enrollment thresholds. But the intention is to, through a combination of things, to be able to to ensure that our general interest courses are breaking even in 23-24. In addition, we're looking at all of our other grants. Again, the PPFs that we've received, some of them are enveloped and some of them were not spent during COVID due to restrictions that were in place. For example, if there was professional development, if that were one of the planned spending areas, and that professional development could not happen because of COVID, then that spending didn't happen. So we have higher than usual amounts of carry forward related to COVID. So we're going to make sure that all of that carry forward is being used for any expenditures which are eligible. And again, this is one-time funding, so this will help us to balance in 23-24, and anything there would be a pressure moving forward. We're also making sure that we're using all the grants and like PPFs, for example, where we have existing expenditures, that we're using that funding to fund existing expenditures before we start to add more. And that we are also reviewing, as you heard, for continuing education, for example, we're making sure that we're operating as efficiently as possible without having significant impacts to programs for 23-24, and then obviously a more detailed review for following years. But for all of those combined, we are estimating about $4.6 million of GSN that will be available to help us assist to balance the budget. We talked about one-to-one device deployments as well. We purchased devices in the summer for the next year, so this will not impact next year's one-to-one device deployment. But a pause in this budget would mean that it impacts 24-25. And so we have options, and we do have a motion to review if this amount can be reduced and if it can be included in the revised estimates. But we're also looking at, one, can it be reduced? And two, how can it be included to ensure that the 24-25 program is not impacted? But this pause will provide us some savings for next year's budget. Additional virtual school enrollment, as the ministry said, we can provide it, we can partner with other boards, or we can look to other boards to accept our students. We are providing it, as we had decided earlier on in this year, and so we have been approached by a neighboring board, and we are working with them to accept their students, so they would become students of TDSB, and that would be an approximate revenue increase of $300,000. The last area, and this is where we would be looking to help us to balance the budget on a one-time basis, is that we know that we haven't been able to deal with our excess capacity, meaning we have more spaces in our schools than we have students. The ministry has always recognized up to 2015 that it costs just as much to operate a school that's full as it does to operate a school that's at a lower capacity. And so there was always what they called a top-up grant, where they would say, okay, the school's enrollment is 300, but you only have 250 students. They would give us grant as if we had 300 students for school operations. And they called that a top-up grant. They eliminated that grant in 2000, I think it was 15, 16, over a period of time. And what that means is that we're no longer provided with that funding. At the same time, they implemented the moratorium, which meant that we had no way to deal with that excess capacity. So we do estimate that our operating costs, and this is a pretty conservative estimate, and this is just referring to the operating cost, not to the capital work that would need to, or the renewal work that would need to happen in those schools. We're estimating it at about $12 million. And then in addition, through motion, we have added the social workers, the CYCs, and the aquatic instructors to use POD next year. And so that would increase it by 3.9 million to 15.9 million. What I will say about proceeds of disposition, and it does say it in the report, is that all of the other options that you saw, they're estimates. And so, and I will say they're conservative estimates. And so if any of those, for example, if we were to receive more than $5 million in special incidents portion reimbursements, or if we were to receive more virtual students from another board that was more than 300,000, what we would do is we would use that revenue to be able to decrease the amount of proceeds that we would use. So this is intended to be the last place that staff will go to help us balance the budget once all of the actuals come in. So again, our uncommitted balance right now is about 85 million. We know that we have started to declare some property surplus, so that number will continue to increase. We also know that we have significant capital needs across the board, which we will need. This is not a sustainable funding source for our operating budget. This is one time to help us balance, to be able to allow us to do some work early next year, to be able to see other reductions that can be made to make up for this difference. So our summary of options to balance, what a coincidence, it comes out to $42.7 million, which is the number that is required to get us to the 15.1. So that means that if all of the options approved, and the numbers that you see again in the budget, in the appendices, do include these options, that would get us to a projected deficit of 15.1 million, and that would mean that our commitment to our 3-year deficit recovery plan would be made. And just to go back to our budget drivers, because again, I think it's really important for us to always tie it back into why we're doing things, and we want to show how our budget is supporting the things that we value. So a reminder of the top 6 budget drivers, and then some, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but this does help us to see where a challenging budget where we've been able to make decisions that help us to support the things that are important to TDSB while still meeting our obligations under the Education Act. So we have not decreased, had direct decreases to staff that directly support our students, other than classroom teachers when it's enrollment driven. We have reduced our special education resource teachers, and I would say that there would be an argument that those teachers would directly support our special education students in some areas, and our COVID positions that we had to decrease. There has been an increase in teaching positions that directly support early reading intervention, math supports, and de-streaming based on the PPFs that we have received. We are keeping or added to the budget 99 positions related to support well-being and student safety. There have been no reductions to school budget allocations. So the change that we made to the carry forward does not impact the school budget allocation. There have been no reductions to budgets that directly support equitable outcomes. And some examples, but certainly not an exhaustive list, is our Model Schools program and our Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement. We have increased budget related to Indigenous education. We have increased budget related to our human rights investigations in order to ensure that they are happening as quickly as we can work through them. So again, not meant to be an exhaustive list, and just wanted to have this here because I think, again, it's important for us to recognize that through a tough budget, we have maintained what we believe to be a budget that supports the areas that we were asked to continue to support based on public feedback. And just a last thank you, because this is probably the last time I will speak on budget this year, maybe. Executive Council, who will be happy that budget is not a item on every single meeting that we have every week. Employee Services, Planning and Enrollment, our Finance and Budget team, and Capital. And then I wanted to just list our staff who have been working tirelessly on this for the last 6 months at least. And just a special thank you, and many of them are sitting over here, so yay. And also to this committee, I'm not sure everybody realized when they signed up how many special effects there would be added to their plate, but again, I just want to thank you for the time that you've taken for the consideration to the budget process. So thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Okay, for questions, we'll start with Trustee Lee.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. First of all, I just want to thank staff for this very comprehensive report, along with all the other, I can only imagine to be tenuous work too.
Sorry, Trustee Lee, your volume is very low.
Is it terrible? Can you hear me now?
That is perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I just want to say thank you to all of our staff members. I really appreciate the hard work that's gone into this budget process. I can only imagine that it's very, very difficult to, look under every stone like you have to try to find savings. And, it's never fun looking for savings within a portfolio. But I only have one comment, and it's the same comment that I made during the last meeting. If we go back to one of the slides, it said 9.9 million from student device program is being added to this year's budget spending reductions. And, as we discussed last meeting, that's not really a expenditure decrease. That's more of a unaccrued deferral of an expenditure that we know will 100% happen in the future. We're just not 100% sure what that amount is. And what that actually does for next year's budget is that it doubles us up for the same line item, where we're only capturing for one year of device expenditures in 2023. We will need to capture for 2 years of device expenditures in 2024. So I am actually 100% not comfortable in including that particular line item as a budget reduction tactic, because that to me is not. That's not a budget reduction. That's just delaying our pain until next year. And next year we will have next year's challenges. And given what we're talking about right now, it's recurring operating expenditures. I don't see next year being less expensive than it is this year. So I like to get a different option from staff on what we do there.
Sorry, just 1 second. I think we already asked for a report in the fall. Correct, I'm just confirming that. So, Director Zucker, do you want to take?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna, just to clarify and make sure that I understand. So we've been asked to come back in the fall to look at how we could potentially add back, maybe not 9 million, but whatever the appropriate number is, based on the work that staff does in reviewing the one-to-one device rollout, and possibly add it back to the revised estimates if we are able to included in 23-24 for 24-25. And then that would be done for the fall.
Thank you. But through you, Madam Chair, we are approving the budget today without that line item, and we barely get to the savings limit that we have to hit. So if we add any number back, we're now over our deficit threshold immediately, assuming our revenue forecast is correct. So I guess my comment is this: if we're comfortable adding it back in the fall when we do our revised budget, do we either know that there's going to be an upside to our revenue or a higher or additional savings coming from somewhere, or are we going to be in the unacceptable deficit position? Where is that money coming from?
So thank you, and through the chair, thank you for that question, and it is a good question. What I will say is that in our options to balance, we have been conservative, and obviously not all of those are actuals. In addition, we don't know if we can decrease that $9 million number or not. There's still work to do with regards to how does bring your own device work into this? How do we ensure that we are supporting equity across the board to ensure that everybody has access to a device without potentially having to deliver a device to every single student? So that work needs to be done to determine what the right number is. Is it 9 million? Is it 8? Is it 4? And then also we will be in a better position. One, we'll know our enrollments. So although again, our planning and enrollment staff have been exceptional at projecting enrollments, COVID has made it a little bit more challenging. And we always err on the side of being conservative. So there is a potential that our enrollments could increase slightly. In addition, those options to balance, for example, if we were to receive more funding related to the SIP reimbursements, or if we were to receive more funding related to any of the other carry forwards, it is possible that we would be able to have some wiggle room in the budget, but we won't know that until, one, staff has the time to be able to go through all of the options to balance and know exactly what they are. 2, we get the enrollments, and 3, we know what number we need to put in the budget to support equitable device access across the board.
Okay, well, through Madam Chair, I appreciate the Associate Director and her commentary, but this is very difficult for me to accept just because we are banking a expenditure that we will sure make. We just don't know what the number is, but it is up to 9 million. We're banking up to $9 million of expenditure against revenue we're saving that we haven't yet identified. And from what I'm seeing right now, our course of action that we're recommending is for us to not accrual for one expenditure line item because we're not sure what we can use to apply against that to cover off the cost. So that to me is not the best way to go about this. So I'm very uncomfortable with approving this proposal right now. I'd like staff to reconsider. I'm not going to move the motion, but I'd like staff to give me a recommendation on what you think we can do. We need to accrue an expense that will happen. That is something that I don't think is optional. If staff believe there are upsides to revenue, I think we can accrue a general upside line item in the budget and see what comes out of that. But at this point, I'm not willing to approve a budget, knowing that there are $9 million that we will spend, but we haven't accounted for. I hope that makes sense. I'm not trying to say that I'm not going to approve a budget. I'm just saying that we need to see an accrual on the budget. And if staff has an estimate on some upsides to our revenue somewhere, we need to see that as a upside, on a forecasted basis as well.
So thank you, and through the chair, in appreciating the trustees' comments and concerns. I guess the way that staff is looking at it is by deferring this to either the revised estimates, or it is possible that we will come back in the fall and say, you know what, everything that we we estimated is correct, or our enrollments aren't the numbers that we expected to be, and therefore we cannot add back to next year's budget. But we will be able, through the 24-25 budget, to be able to include. And trustees will be able to either say, we're going to include 2 years of expenditures in 24-25, which I wouldn't say is going to be possible, or we are going to be always purchasing for the year that we're going to incur the expenditure with the year's budget that it relates to, and therefore we would purchase and have them delivered in September versus the summer, and we would have a month delay or approximately a month delay in the students receiving the devices. So I understand that where the trustee is coming from with regards to concerns about delaying an expenditure. I would say that I would support an expenditure happening for the year that the expenditure actually relates to, and that on an ongoing basis that's where we would be. And it would give us an opportunity to ensure that, again, the expenditure that we're incurring is correct. And when I say that the amounts are conservative, I'm not saying that they're unrealistic. I just am saying that we want to make sure that we're not put in a position where we're actually coming back to you in the fall and saying, all of the options that we propose are actually not providing what we hope that they would. So I believe that this is a realistically conservative budget.
Thank you, through Madam Chair, to the Associate Director. Once again, I appreciate the difficulties. I appreciate everything that you've explained, through Madam Chair, Madam Associate Director. My point stands as that we have a short expenditure. We are looking to delay it without a funding source. To me, if this is the case, then we need to find another $9 million from our current budget as a budget reduction to cover off the cost until we can have a short source of funding to cover for this, or until we know what the revised cost is. That's why I moved the motion last week with a level of urgency, and this is where I am still right now. So at this point, I am just to be on the record, will not be voting yes to this budget with this $9 million line item sitting unfunded, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Trustee Dawson.
Thank you, through the chair. Firstly, I just want to thank staff for the incredible amount of work that has gone into this process and ultimately the final proposal before us. It's really amazing, and this is my first time through this process, so I really do appreciate all of the efforts that went into this, and also the effort to help trustees understand the process and provide us with comprehensive information. With that said, I'm going to agree with Trustee Lee, just as somebody whose child has and child's friends have benefited from the one-to-one device program. I cannot stress enough how critical it is to ensuring our students are competent adults in the workforce. This is the way of the future now. For trustees who aren't totally familiar with the one-to-one device program, each kid in grade 5 and in grade 9 gets a device. It's a Chromebook, and it is used in classroom instruction for completing assignments, homework, and it's really used in a way that will help to achieve goals for making student skill sets relevant to the future. So I think that this is so critical. I'm uncomfortable as well with the idea that we don't know where this $9 million is going to come from in the future. And I'd like to understand what the options are. I know it'll come at the expense of something, but I would like to understand what the options are to adding back the one-to-one device program into this year, into the 2023-24 year. Thank you, through the chair.
So thank you, and through the chair, I just want to make sure that, and clarify, to make sure I've been clear, that the devices for next year, so for next year's budget, for next year's students, is not impacted. Those devices will be purchased this summer and will be part of the 22-23 budget. So when we're talking about next year's budget, we're talking about the students in 24-25. We still have a lot of data to gather as part of that process in order to bring something forward. And we can look at whether or not we can include it in next year's budget or the year after's. So it's a pause it's a delay in the purchase that we're suggesting, not a discontinuation of the process. And again, that delay will help us to possibly improve the one-to-one device deployment to ensure that students that really need the devices are receiving them.
Okay, thanks. So through the chair, just a question on that last part, to ensure students are receiving the devices who really need them. I think all students need them. So can you just clarify that comment?
Thank you, and through the chair, I'm going to use a personal example because I can, and it's not this board, but my daughter received a device in grade 9, but had her own personal laptop, and that device sat in her room for 4 years, never touched. So we want to make sure that we're not giving devices to students who aren't going to need them because they already have their own devices that they would prefer, or ensuring, we also know that many of our schools have devices that they're using as well. And so we need to make sure that we need to have time to look at our entire inventory to see if we're able to use any of those or not, because the schools may be using them in other ways. We also need to be able to look at students like my daughter who didn't use her device, and we can look at actual usage of the devices. We have that ability to be able to see how many of them are currently being used that are deployed. And we want to make sure that we have, again, the appropriate budget set aside to be able to purchase them, because there is no argument that devices are necessary, in that we want to make sure that we are equitably providing the resources necessary to our students.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we have Trustee McLean.
Thank you, and through the chair. Just so I'm going to stay on the computers because I think it's important, and I want to make sure I'm understanding the message that the associate director, like this June, as part of our current operating year's budget, we just recently approved $9 million for the computers to come next year. So we're budgeting it a year in advance. In the staff proposal as it is, if I'm understanding it correctly, we would, instead of budgeting it a year in advance, and instead of ordering it in the summer so that we would have ready to go for the next school year, week 1 in September, we're considering changing it to an in-year ordering form. So we're going to order the computers in the year that we're going to use them, instead of being 1 year in advance. So we would have no expenditures theoretically in this budget, but we would budget the following year the $9 million, which instead of spending at the end of the year, we would spend at the beginning of the year, and those computers would come in time for the 24-25 year, and that there would be in fact no year in which the students went without. Did I understand roughly?
Thank you, through the chair, and you explained it much better than I did, so thank you.
Okay, and I have nothing further at this time. Thanks.
Next, we have Trustee Earhart.
Thank you. Hello, and is there any trouble hearing me there in the room?
Yep,
Chair?
you're good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much to staff for the materials and all of the support and responsiveness throughout this budget process. It's sincerely appreciated. I've asked similar versions of this question before, and so permit me to ask again. I am concerned about the school-based staffing cuts and how in some schools the combined effect of multiple staffing cuts, particularly to office staff. I've spoken a great deal about vice principals throughout the budget process. I did ask questions earlier today to staff and the chair, and I'm asking publicly now around clerical office staff support as well, in instances where clerical support will be needing to be sharing between schools because of reduced allocations. And I am worried about the start of the school year and what this is going to mean to schools that are facing multiple combined cuts. I'm wondering, as this is my first year on the board, it will be my first September as a trustee, if we could get a bit of an idea of how things work in the fall and what opportunities there are for adjustments to be made if needed for the safety and smooth operation of schools, and what opportunities trustees will get to hear system update around this. Thank you very much.
So thank you, and through the chair, and the trustee is correct. There has been a decrease in our central or our school-based administration due to the reduction in COVID funding. Again, those positions would have been in place for 2 years. But I'm going to go to our executive officer, Lorraine Linton, to respond to your question regarding, or your second part of the question, sorry.
Thank you, and through the chair, the question with regards to school support staff, there are times where within the collective agreements, we do find that we do have to split, as it were, the QP clerical staff. So I just wanted to respond to Trustee Earhart's concern regarding that. What we try to do is we try to ensure that the FTE is 1.0 and that each of the clerical are within one school. However, there are times where we do have to split that. We ensure that there's a lunch provided to the workers and that they can actually move pretty quickly through to their other school site. As it relates to extra supports in the fall, if necessary, we do review with the associate director and others the specific needs in schools. Those needs come by way of the the superintendents, and then that comes through to us, and we would review those pieces in the fall. Thank you.
Trustee Earhart, was that all of your questions?
Thank you. That was helpful. Do we have, what financial updates will be coming back to board in the fall? Just to have a better understanding of what opportunities then there are to discuss sort of the impacts taking place in schools related to this proposed budget. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Executive Officer Snyder to provide trustees with the examples of when we provide updates with regards to in-year funding.
Through you, Madam Chair. We will do an update. We'll start our budget process earlier next year because we won't have the municipal election in place. So we'll start with a budget schedule for 24-25, but we will also bring updates for revised estimates called. So it's after the October 31st enrollment. We recast our budget and we will look at what the change in enrollment is. And then we look at other things such as the SIP claims and what turned out with that. And we'll look at other changes in our staffing and or other assumptions we had. But that'll be our first big time to update trustees around the 23-24 school year. And then again, after the second half of the year, in our April timeframe, we'll bring a report And this one will do the same thing, but it's more detailed. What happens in this report is we'll look at our expenditures for the first 6 months and see if our assumptions are holding, but we'll also forecast the year end and tell you where we expect the year to end based on the first 6 months of operations. And then there'll be various other reports that'll come through the budget process around things like the computers. We'll bring back the information on the one-to-one device strategy in the falls. We're starting to build the budget. And the discussion earlier on the first report tonight around continuing education, we'll bring back information in the fall around those variances in there and what can be done to address that.
Okay, thanks very much. That was very helpful. And just again, thanks to all staff that have worked on this budget, and also just thanks to the many staff that I know are directly impacted by this budget process for continuing to serve our students with joy, acceptance, and belonging in mind throughout the whole year, despite the stress of this budget. I've tried to contain my emotion throughout this entire session, but also today, just knowing that everyone here I know has made great efforts to keep to those budget drivers, but just knowing that we have been reporting to the Ministry of Education and that they are aware of the financial situation, and that this current government is aware of this financial situation, has surplus funds right now, and is choosing not to allocate them to our schools. So that continues to be a source of immense frustration, anger, and disappointment. But I have nothing but immense respect for everyone who is continuing to serve our students through this. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass the chair. Yeah, so I want to echo the thanks to staff for all of the work that has gone into this, and bringing us a budget within our time frame, despite the delays from the ministry and the challenges of the current year. And also want to thank trustees for bringing forward proposals to make modifications, and especially around different staffing complements, to bring back staffing and get us to those positions that we've added back despite the cut in COVID funding. I just wanted trustees to know that at the Ontario Public School Boards Association annual general meeting 2 weeks, is it 2 weeks ago? Time is going. 2 weeks ago, all boards in the province did charge the president of OBSPA with advocating on our behalf as a collective, as one voice, for review and increase in education spending, to advocate on our behalf for finances. And I just want to mark that because that hasn't happened before. Although in the TDSB, we do the budget in our own way, and we have unique challenges within the City of Toronto. Not everybody across the province, not all boards across the province have those same challenges. Not everybody, in some boards, the funding benchmarks do work. There are a lot more boards facing challenges this year, but there was a collective recognition across the province, especially in light of the $22 billion in surplus that the province is sitting on, that that the ministry needs to, not just the ministry, but the province needs to focus investment on education. So that work is begun, and that is as one voice. And my initial report from the president is that the Minister of Education was a bit taken aback that he did stand up and listen, or put his head up and listen, because this has never happened before, that all the boards have asked as one voice for this advocacy. I don't know where that'll get us, but I just wanted you to know that is happening on our behalf. Just in terms of the conversation about funding things in year versus putting them off till the next year, I just wondered if staff could explain, and I don't know if you could do it in this forum well, when we have in-year savings, I know that they go into working reserves or they go towards reserves. I know that we can't use them. So our 2020 to 2023 in-year savings, we can't use them to plan for the next budget, I believe. But when those financials come in, could they be used towards things like purchasing devices, purchasing computers? I know we've never been funded for our one-to-one device program. That's our local decision. So it's always been something that was going to depend on our financial situation. But I do know that the amounts that we save from things like, or unspent funds from things like PPFs, that we can't plan our next budget based on those numbers. But could we use those towards things like devices?
So thank you, and through the chair. So there's a couple of things. If we were to have a surplus at the end of the year and we're going to go into our working fund reserves, trustees could appoint an internally restricted reserve or a reserve for a specific purpose. So they could say, you know what, we've got a $9 million surplus and we want you to assign that $9 million to technology. And then through the next year, we would purchase that technology. When we have reserves, so complicated, but we would have a surplus in 1 year of $9 million. And all things being equal, we would have a deficit in the next year of $9 million. So it does impact our in-year deficit, although the ministry does take that into account when they're looking at, is this a recurring structural deficit or is this a planned deficit? So that is possible. Certainly 22-23 has a projected deficit of $40.4 million. We know that we have some cost pressures related to sick leave, and so our sick leave is likely going to come in higher than we expected. We also know that we may receive some relief with the claims that we're making with regards to our special incidents portion. So we are hopeful that we will be within the 40.4 million that we had projected, but we're certainly not going to be in a surplus position to be able to assign funding. With regards to the carry forwards that the ministry has, in a lot of instances, the funding has been carried forward because there are specific requirements attached to that funding. So we need to be very careful on how we spend it. If it was in any way allocated for technology, we would certainly be able to use it to purchase technology. But I will say right now, there is not $9 million in carry forwards related to technology that we would be able to use.
Okay, thank you. So for our device purchase, our one-to-one program, are we in advance taking into account students that would have government-funded claims for computers? And I will also go to a personal example. My child gets a computer assigned through a special education equipment grant that she uses at school. She doesn't bring it home because we don't need it at home. So it's a classroom resource. But she's only in grade 4. I would assume that next year I would be able to tell you that we don't need a computer.
Yeah, and thank you. And through the chair, or through you, we would take that into account for sure. So that would already be included that a student who's receiving a device for special education purposes would not be counted in the total of required devices because that would be considered their personal devices. And again, that speaks a lot to the equity concerns, is that when everybody is receiving a device, then our students that have special education needs and that need them for their purposes aren't necessarily singled out. So it is not taking, or we are not funding those devices twice, or those students twice, and we do take that into account. So the $9 million that we've been spending previously would not include any of those special education equipment amounts.
Okay, thank you very much. Trustee Laskin?
Thank you very much. Can I try the computers one more time? Because I really believe there's a misunderstanding. We don't start a budget from zero. We know how much we spend this year in the actuals, and we need to know that because it's a 3-year budget forecast. So for 23-24, we know we have to get down to 15.1. In this year's budget, there was $9 million for computers. In next year's budget, there isn't $9 million for computers. That's not playing accounting games, in my mind. That is not funding computers in the 23-24 budget. Just like there are fewer teachers, so we minus that out. Just like there are fewer this, so we minus that out. So it's not as if we have to find that money or accrue it from something else, or am I completely misunderstanding the accounting? Through you, Madam Chair, to staff.
Trustee Laskin, through the chair, you are correct, and that's how it would be, is that, again, our funding next year would be for the year after, and if we don't spend it next year, then it would be spent the year after and not included in our budget, nor we would be accruing for it.
Thank you very much. And if I can push further, then my understanding is there is a report that will be coming to talk about, is 9 million the right number, to do an analysis about, nobody is saying that the one-to-one device program isn't important, because we know it's important. We fought for years to get it, and it's only in its second year. So, but an analysis will be done. So my understanding is you mentioned that if by some miracle, once you do the budget estimates on the actuals after the first quarter, and there is money, there could be consideration to buy some in 23-24 for 24-25. But in actual fact, the thought from staff now is not buying them a year in advance, but in the 24-25 budget will be X million dollars for the right amount of money for the one-to-one devices in 24-25 moving forward. Is that correct? Through you, Madam Chair.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I think I'm crystal clear on computers. I did want to mention, for those that were listen to the deputations of my little clarification with Mr. Weatherup, we do have different recollections of what happened. I completely agree that the supervisor in 2003 was not able to cut $90 million. But where we disagree is that the supervisor in 2003, although he said his budget would show an increase on classroom teaching and books, when the budget was actually unveiled on November 19th, 2002, it cut classroom spending by $30 million. So different decisions were made by government than would have been made by locally elected trustees, and that was the point I wanted to make, Madam Chair. So this committee is charged with, and the mandate of this committee in our bylaws under 4.7.3, included in our responsibilities on this committee, is to consider strategies to balance the capital and operating budget over a multi-year period, and to make recommendations to the board. And that's among other things. But given comments by colleagues on this committee, I'd actually like to amend the motion, Madam Chair. And instead of having it be, it is recommended that the board approve the 2023-2024 budget estimates as a committee vote. I'd actually like to move it without recommendation to board. And my understanding is Trustee McLean will second that. So
McLean will second.
On committee, but moving it without recommendation from FBEC, but moving it to all 22 trustees at board. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. So the motion on the floor is to move the budget from this committee directly to board. Do we have any speakers? Sorry, I know, see, Trustee Lee, you had another question.
I also had a comment on motion.
You want to comment on the motion? Okay.
Thank you. Through Madam Chair, I appreciate Trustee Laskin's motion. I wholeheartedly disagree with doing it that way. The purpose of this committee is to gather a group of trustees who are ideally knowledgeable and more has been working on the finance file for the entire year. And the recommendation from this committee is valued because the committee or the trustees on this committee are way more informed on the matters surrounding a budget and financial planning than the board would as a whole, just because we spend more time here and we have gone through the deliberations and we have the background. To approve this motion is to override the purpose of this committee. It is also not giving this committee a chance to exercise its value and its point to exist. And it is also overriding the expertise, the experience, and the knowledge background from every single trustee that sit on this committee. So I am very, very wholeheartedly in disagreement to this motion. I think this committee needs to be given the chance and the ability to express its opinion and its recommendation to board. We cannot be overridden, otherwise this committee will lose its purpose to exist. Okay, I understand the purpose of the motion. I understand that the mover and Trustee Laskin, I appreciate 100%. I understand that you would not like to see a budget fail to pass in this committee or even risk that. But if a budget doesn't pass the finance committee, it doesn't pass for a reason. And that reason has to be respected. So I do not support this motion at all. Thank you. Madam Chair.
Oh, thank you. Okay, do we have, sorry, I'll come back. I just wanted to double check. Is there any other speakers to this? Trustee Pei?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wholeheartedly echo Trustee Lee's comments regarding, his comments about this motion. Although I'm not on the FBEC committee, but listen the conversation between Trustee Laskin and Trustee Lee. I think it's the FBEC committee is supposed to be independent committee. They should have their voice. They should have their opinion. And I wholeheartedly support Trustee Lee's comments. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Trustee Patel. Oh, sorry. Laskin, sorry. Did you want to speak last on your motion or did you want to reply?
Sure. Can't I speak as many times as I want
Yes,
to?
you can.
But Trustee Patel hasn't spoken yet, so I will defer to him.
Okay. Thank you. Trustee Patel?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Trustee Laskin. Well, I don't support this motion, and there's a reason behind that, right? As Trustee Lee said, everybody has some sort of knowledge of finance and expertise. And this is the reason why we are here. We come here, we talk, we chat. There's an agreement, there's a disagreement. And every committee has those type of things, right? Simply just by not having an agreement on certain things, or we don't want to discuss or don't debate on certain things like that, I think we are setting a wrong precedent at the committee level. to referring everything to the board now. And this will be a stepping stone. Do I respect Trustee Laskin's point of view, but I have to disagree on this because this undermines the committee's work. And I cannot support this motion. I'm here to discuss, debate the budget, but I cannot support this. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Trustee Laskin?
Thank you very much. This isn't precedent setting. The same thing was done last year. The committee must move, as part of its mandate, a recommendation on a budget to board. If the committee votes no, without putting out some other recommendation on a budget to board, the committee is not fulfilling its mandate. So just to vote no, there's nothing that gets moved forward to board. I would be moving a minority report, so that also would have to go to board because the board must vote on a budget. Remember, this committee only recommends to board. So if this committee, as I'm understanding through the speakers, is not going to vote to move a motion to board, the board still has a right to vote on its budget. And I have never been part, of an FBEC committee that doesn't support the staff budget and yet doesn't put an alternative budget. Something is always got to move to board. So my understanding, based upon the conversation of the committee members here, is they are not prepared to move the staff budget. I am not prepared to not have a budget go to board, because I actually take the role on this committee seriously, that if I didn't like the staff budget, I'd be proposing some sort of alternative budget, because it's my responsibility to put forward a recommendation for a budget to board. So that's why, instead of it failing at committee, no problem, you can vote this down. If there's a majority that's going to do that, then I will be moving a minority report, because the board has a right to vote on its budget, and members have a right to put substitutions in. I'm not debating that. Some trustees didn't want one thing, they wanted staff to come up with an alternative. No, at this stage of the budget process, it's up to trustees to come up with an alternative. It's not up to staff anymore. Staff have recommended their best budget estimate. So no problem, whatever the committee decides to do, the committee will do. But just like last year where there was conversations and it was moved without recommendation to board, that's why I moved it. And I'm happy to have a conversation with my colleagues, but I actually believe that if one wants to not support the staff budget, which is before us, no issue. But the committee has a responsibility to move a budget to the board. And I have not heard anyone, no member of this committee, move any alternative, as I have in the past budget conversations through my years. So, Madam Chair, I'm not going to withdraw it. The vote will be what it will be, but if it fails and the committee doesn't support the staff budget, then I will move a minority report, because the board has a right to have a budget before it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we have Trustee Dawson.
Thank you. And through the chair, my question was just procedural about what happens, and Trustee Laskin answered it with the minority report comment. So I'll withdraw from the list. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Trustee Lee.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, I just want to be on the record that I don't believe what Trustee Laskin has outlined is correct. I understand that in the past, I may have believed that this was the case, but from all the experiences I have had as a trustee and also my professional career, I can outline a couple of things for the trustees who probably heard this for the first time. This is not a staff budget. This is your budget. When I say your budget, I mean you as all the trustees. You owe a fiduciary duty to this board and all the communities that you represent to pass the budget that you believe in. It is staff's responsibility to provide you with the budget that you can approve. And it is also staff's responsibility to give you the recommendations when you don't approve something. Okay, so it is not, the trustees on this board do not have the in-depth information We do not have access to the details of data, and we do not have the access to the finance team that our director does to develop a appropriate alternative when something doesn't work out. So when a trustee asks you to develop your own alternative and come up with something that's different from what staff has developed, that is not a fair ask to you, because that is not your role. Your role is to approve, ask questions, make recommendations, or disapprove something when you don't believe in something. That is your role as a trustee. If you get pushed into making a decision because you think you must do it and you have no other choice, when you make that decision, you have committed to it. It's not you always have a choice to say no, and you always have a choice to ask staff to go back and come back with a version that works better. Of course, within reason, that I highly recommend you give a suggestion. When it comes to my reason for not supporting the budget, I have outlined that clearly in the last time that this committee has met. I've said very clearly that I am uncomfortable with not setting aside budget for an expenditure that we will 100% expend in the future. Our staff members have confirmed today once and again that this is absolutely a delay in expenditure that will happen in the future, although we just are not yet sure how much that is. Trustee Laskin made a point earlier when she spoke to say, is this the same as, hey, not reducing the number of staff headcount and hiring them back in the next year? Staff member gave an answer, but I will interpret it this way. It is absolutely not the same. When you do not hire one teacher for one full school year, that expenditure is eliminated forever. You will not spend it again. You will not hire the same teacher and pay that same person twice the next year. Okay. But when we delay the expenditure of these devices that we're talking about in this committee today, it is our intention to either replace or buy them in full or in part quantity the year after. So you're not eliminating any expenditure, you're deferring it. And the reason why you're deferring an expenditure is so that you can balance a budget today. Staff's responsibility is to present you with a balanced budget on an operating basis, taking into consideration that the costs that we're talking about here are most likely recurring costs. So you need to make sure that you don't just budget for 1 year with defer for 1 year because there's an going concern that you have to be concerned for. So it is your responsibility to make a decision on whether or not you're comfortable with delaying up to $9 million of budget that you know you will spend next year to the year after and have a potential of spending that money twice, on the year after. Or you can forever delay the budget to future years. But just like being late on a bill once, that bill doesn't go away. You still eventually has to pay it. So this is why I am having a lot of concern with this conversation. And this is why I, once again, do not agree with a lot of comments that are made in this committee, although I respect dearly the members that have made it. I appreciate where they're getting at and where they're coming from. But I just want everyone to understand, this is not to say that we're not doing our jobs. In fact, if we say no to this budget right now today, I believe we are doing our jobs. We are asking our staff members to go back, use their expertise, and come back. We can have a meeting tomorrow. We can have 2 meetings tomorrow. We can do it until we're comfortable to go to board. I fully intend to pass the budget that works within this committee, but this version I cannot support. Okay, so for all of my colleague committee members, just know that you do have a choice. You're not doing the wrong thing by voting it down, and it is okay to ask staff to come up with a new recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have the director. Oh, sorry. The director wanted to make a comment, and then we have trustees Patel, Cherneslin, and McLean.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, I will save my remarks until trustees have spoken.
Thank you. Trustee Patel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to clarify, we are not talking about budget. We are not undermining what staff has done. We are appreciative of what staff has done. Over here, we are talking about a procedure. And I think this motion is about a procedure. I'm surprised that my colleague, even before the vote has happened, has already assumed that it's going to fail. That's the biggest surprise to me. That on what assumption is my trustee colleague thinking that this recommendation by staff will fail? And even if it fails here, it has gone as a minority report, it always goes to the board. I mean, it's a healthy thing to do it. If committee members are not okay with this, there's nothing wrong with this. So, I mean, I felt a bit surprised when I heard that it's going to fail. And let's be very clear. I'm not talking about budget. We are talking about the motion. Alternative budget is not in here for a discussion. Over here, a procedure is in discussion. So let's put a good argument on the process, not on the budget side. Let's keep the budget right now as a separate item. And let's be very clear that I'm voting on this motion, not on the budget. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Trustee Chernos-Lynn. Oh. Oh. Okay, I don't. Okay, sorry, so that was there was a request for a break after we're done with this motion. Next we have Trustee McLean.
Thank you, and through the chair. I guess my reaction is a little bit to Trustee Lee's. No, like if we vote no, and then I guess we haven't, the trustees on the committee that aren't interested in what's going on, like I'm not sure there's a timeline going forward for the meeting tomorrow and meeting the next day, and no one's asked staff, you know, if they think there's additional options, how long it would take to prepare. You know, we have a responsibility by the end of the month, and at some point we need to deal with that, and it needs to be a broader discussion than just the 9. I do agree that the committee has worked very hard. The members, staff have worked very hard to understand the issues, debate the issues, and you know, make a recommendation. Although we've had a number of colleagues that have attended regularly and contributed in a big way. They're not required to be here, and the members of the committee have made the effort and done so. So, like, I just think we need to get it to our colleagues, and if we can't agree, then a broader discussion, I guess, needs to take place. Is why I thought this was better than a no vote. But yeah, I'm not sure where the extra time is to find Trustee Lee's, you know, alternatives that lead to an FBEC recommendation to the other. Like, I'm not sure where all that gets done, and we haven't even, the committee, other than last week, you know, Trustee Lee brought forward his concerns, and I thought the fall kind of took those into consideration, but they're back again. So I'm not sure where the time is, and no one along the line has asked staff if they're in a position to provide additional recommendations beyond that which they've provided. So I guess I'll leave it with there. Thank you.
Next, we have Trustee Pei.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do echo Trustee Lee and Trustee Patel that we as trustee, we should go through our independent thought process, make an independent decision without other trustee try to push us into a certain position to vote for. I mean, this is motion, like Trustee Purcell said. This is trustee was asked to vote on this motion, not really vote is on the actual budget. I really don't think this is motion have any merit. Otherwise, why we need that committee? The committee is supposed to make recommendations to the full board, right? It's not all the members of the full board coming to this committee to make a decision. Not everybody have the time, not everybody have the expertise, okay? I assume all the members on this committee, they have expertise or at least have this significant interest, or time spent on this report recommended by the staff. I have a lot of questions to ask staff. Already asked it, but I don't have answer. I didn't get the answer, by the way, right? I'm going to ask you the same question on the board again. Why we present some number without knowing basic data?
Trustee Pei, this is on the motion. This is on the motion.
I don't understand. I'm talking about the motion, Madam Chair, okay? So I wholeheartedly support Trustee Lee and Trustee Purcell's comments, okay? Let's committee to vote for the budget. Not recommend, the whole budget to the whole board. Otherwise, it's really lose, the function of the committee. Thank you very much.
Next, Trustee Shan.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I think, it's important to recognize this particular motion is a strategic motion. It is a motion that's put forward in order to avoid going into a situation where the board might vote against it. So it's not a mandate related argument, or it's not related to the procedure. It's mostly related to a strategy, which I'm fine with, and I will call it what it is. And I think I will end up supporting this particular motion, particularly around the strategy piece, not necessarily thinking that this is the mandate of the committee, and vice versa. As a committee, I also want to stress that I don't see the committee being chosen as an expertise. Committee of trustees is chosen to be dividing up the workload, to come together to figure out ways in which we recommend something. The board finally makes the decision. So I don't think we should claim that everybody in finance committee has a financial expertise, everybody in program. It is not based on expertise, it's based on interest. Though some people might choose to have this committee based on their interest. So I don't think that we should assume that we as a board, as a committee, have to ultimately put something forward because we need to as a committee. The recommendation here, we are making a recommendation. The recommendation here basically is to say that this is complicated enough. There's not consensus on this. So let's bring it to the full board to discuss it together. That's the recommendation. So the committee is able to make the recommendation as a strategic recommendation. People can vote against it, for it, and so on. But I don't think I think the problem is that the arguments that's put forward for this motion and against the motion are a bit off. One, it is not procedurally, we are not procedurally implicated to support this motion. We can procedurally not support this motion. At the same time, we shouldn't assume that just because we are a committee that we need to make a recommendation all the time. It's a committee. We could come to any point in different meetings where we might need to say to the rest of the committee members that this is complex enough that we don't need to make a statement on this right now. We could pass it to the entire board and do it together. And the entire board has been involved in this budget process. It's not like we have worked on it independently. Every step of the way, entire board had been part of the process through different board meetings as well. So I don't see it being any different from the past practices.
Thank you. And then we have Trustee Laskin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We've had a number of finance, budget, and enrollment committees. At the June 1st meeting, staff presented an appendix that was full of all their options that trustees could have picked from if they didn't like what the staff presented. Only today, at the 11th hour, do we now hear that staff should be presenting different options? I think that's completely unfair. If trustees wanted different options that weren't included in the staff budget, that really hasn't changed since June 1st, except for the addition of social workers, child and youth counselors, and aquatics instructors, it hasn't changed. And options have been provided. Staff is charged with giving us their best advice on the budget. They're also charged with giving us options if we don't like their best advice. But I really, at least it is certainly not my experience, that if we say to staff, we don't like this, they have to come back with a different option, when in fact, in Appendix B, they gave us a number of categories of options that trustees could have substituted, should they have wished to substitute. We all knew this as a special meeting to put forward a budget for the special board meeting on Thursday to meet the timeline. This is not the time to say we don't like this option, bring forward another option. Certainly not in my experience at all. That being said, absolutely, trustees have every right to not support the staff budget. But again, if they don't support the staff budget, what will you then support? Because if you're not prepared to make that decision, which is part of our responsibilities, then others will make that decision for us if we can't pass this by the board. Trustee Patel asked how I knew it wouldn't pass. Because Trustee Patel, I asked members of this committee if they would support it or not. That's how I know that it wouldn't pass. So in all seriousness, I wanted to get all our colleagues involved, because ultimately this is the board's budget. It's not FBEC's budget. And I completely agree with Trustee Shan. We're not on this committee because we're experts. That's what staff are for. We're on this committee because we had an interest in what I thought was fulfilling the mandate of this committee, one of which is to produce a budget for the board. So however the votes fall, the votes fall. But ultimately, all 22 of us get to vote on a budget. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I have to say, I respectfully disagree, Shelley, Trustee Laskin. I do think people have the right to vote how they wish on this motion or on any motion. That is people's right, and I think people do it in for different reasons. So I think for me, this motion is moving it to FBEC or moving it to full board. I always, to be honest, find the budget a hard one to be done at committee. I understand why it's done at committee, but I also think that it's just a recommendation to board. The budget is such a big piece that we all have a fiduciary responsibility in, that moving it to board for me is, I don't have a problem the way some of my committee members have spoken about feeling like it takes the decision away from the committee. The decision is ultimately with the board. And this is such a big one that I think everybody wants to weigh in. So I don't see this quite the same way maybe as taking something from the committee. I'm only allowed to speak to the motion on the floor, so that's really all I'm going to say now, because I'm going to try to keep it tight that way. But I am hoping that regardless of where we end up on this motion, that we can have a recess after this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the director wanted to comment. Yeah. Nobody else on board?
Thank you very much, through the chair. As director, I appreciate that it is incredibly difficult for trustees under these circumstances facing a structural deficit and additional student needs. I also recognize that members of FBEC have been incredibly diligent and attentive over the course of an unprecedented number of FBEC meetings this year. And there are trustees who have been present in person and online throughout the many committee meetings that have occurred to focus on our deficit. On May 23rd, staff put forward options to balance where the one-to-one device was proposed as an option to balance the budget. The total is $9 million. I do wish, and I remember asking trustees if you were concerned about the options that staff are putting forward, that you redirect us through passing motions so that we had clarity to be able to go back and redevelop a budget that you would give further consideration to. Staff proposed using proceeds of disposition because we could not identify an additional $15 million, additional budget to be able to, or areas to reduce in order to get to the approved amount. So it is unlikely in my experience as director, based on the work staff has done over the course of the last number of months, that we will be able to go back and find an additional $9 million. If we were able to, we would not have suggested using proceeds of disposition. So, of course, it is up to FBEC to determine how to redirect staff. I'm just being realistic about what it is that we may or may not be able to bring back to you or to the board, in light of the fact that we already identified using proceeds of disposition, and that we were not able to, when a motion was put forward last week, to find another $3.7 million to bring back much needed staff. Thank you.
Thank you. There's nobody else on the list. So could we open the vote, please?
Trustee Lee is against.
Thank you.
Sean in favor.
McLean in favor.
Patel is against.
Trustee Wong?
Wong is against.
And that carries. So that's it for this part of the meeting. Our next item on our agenda is private matters, but there has been a request for a recess. So we will take a 15-minute recess.